Hello, I'm Fiona and I'm currently a content design consultant at Accenture. Over the last 10 years that I've worked in content and user experience, I've had a lot of different job titles, from UX planner, copywriter to UX content strategist. And the common thread throughout all those roles has been a passion for solving problems for users and a belief that content is a really crucial way that we can do that. Over the last few years, I've worked mostly in the public and charity sectors, and I've seen the impact of mental health crisis and cost of living crisis on vulnerable people. I've been part of incredible teams creating services to help people get emotional and financial support when they need it. And I've worked on social security benefits, supporting people in their journey from a benefit that they've been receiving for most of their lives to a completely new benefit that they know very little about. I've taken notes in user research sessions where I've watched people react to information about where they can turn for help during a mental health crisis. And I've listened to users talk about overwhelming anxiety and fear they felt receiving an important looking letter that they didn't understand fully. So I'm very aware of the value of well-designed content and the difference it can make to people's lives. But whichever particular field you work in within user-centered design or within content.
So
I'm going to assume that you're here today because you think that high quality content is pretty important too. I'm also going to assume that a lot of the content professionals here today have had an experience where the content work you do has been undervalued. Maybe you've been given a lot of unrealistic deadlines and questioned why your work takes so much time when it's just writing. Or maybe you've been excluded from important meetings and decisions that you know will have a huge impact on your ability to support users. In my experience, content is one of the few areas of product development that most stakeholders feel qualified to have an opinion on. I think this is because although most people have access to the tools of content design, words, they don't necessarily have a good understanding of what makes content user-centered. As a result, I think that more than other professions, we often feel a need to explain our processes. In the user-centered design world that I work in, and I'm sure a lot of people here work in, we talk a lot about working in the open. And I believe that it's important that we're accountable for our design decisions, that we share work early and involve subject matter experts. But I think we can also acknowledge that every time we share something, we're making a choice about what we do and don't share and how we share it. And we're all subject to biases. We hold certain beliefs about what is and isn't important, and this impacts the information we choose to share and how we share it. And I've observed that as a profession, we often feel a burden, I think more than others, to show our working and justify our expertise. And I think this is out of a desire to work openly, but I also see that sometimes it reinforces the idea that anyone can create high quality content because everybody writes. And don't get me wrong, I think that most people could learn to design content, but I also think most people could learn to create a design in a program like Sketch or to code a website. But what I've observed about content professionals is we often feel the need to teach other people how to do our job. I don't think I've ever worked in a content team where at some point someone hasn't run training for the rest of the organisation on how to write clearly. And it's not necessarily that there's anything wrong with that, but it's not something that I very often see from other disciplines. So before I get started, I want to define what I mean by the term plain language. Some of you might be more familiar with the term plain English, which is a term that was coined by the Plain English Campaign, a private organisation founded in the UK in 1979. Technically, for something to be plain English, it must meet the requirements of a set of guidelines, which includes recommendations like using short sentences and avoiding certain words and terms. This is different to the term plain language as defined by Ginny Reddish, also in 1979 in the US. Her form of plain language is assessed by how well the language you're using meets the needs of your audience, which is much more aligned with what we've come to mean by content design. My understanding of the technical difference between the two is mostly thanks to Caroline Jarrett, and you'll find a link to her work in the references at the end of the deck. But although plain English and plain language technically mean different things, one being rule-based and the other being more user-focused, most people are not really aware of this distinction. Plain English Campaign is still very influential, And in my experience, most stakeholders outside content are familiar with the basic principles of plain English, but don't have much awareness of plain language beyond an assumption that it's a kind of language agnostic version of plain English. So in my talk today, I'll mostly be using the term plain language, but not in the way it's defined by Jenny Reddish, but in a way I think it's more often used and understood. And that's as a rules-based system that when you follow it will guarantee that your writing is clearer, irrespective of the audience. So today I want to give you 3 reasons why I think it's time that we stop talking about plain language, and I hope by the end that you will agree. Firstly, I want to talk about why I think plain is a bad word to describe the technique of writing clearly. Secondly, I want to talk about why I think that relying on plain language, sorry, I'm losing my voice, why I think that relying on plain language to explain our work miscommunicates what content design is about. And then I want to finish by talking about how focusing on plain language means missing the strategic value that content designers bring. So first of all, why don't I like the term plain? As content designers, we understand the power of language and how word choice influences people's perceptions. Using clear language can open up a service and make it more accessible, while using lots of specialist or technical language can intimidate and confuse. Labeling is such a powerful way to influence the way we think. It's even used as a meditation technique. As you meditate, thoughts naturally come up, and if you label anything that comes up as a thought, you're more able to notice it, let it go, and return to your focus. And you can get your focus back because by labeling what's happening in your head, you put it into a category, which means you can then file it away. In other words, you don't need to think about something once you've given it a label. So we need to be very careful about how we use labels, because once we found a mental category for something, we've created that shortcut in our head and we stop thinking about it properly. Our perception of it becomes more instinctual, and we stop being aware that we're making a judgment. Information architect Abby Covert makes a distinction between the intent of a piece of content, for example, a label, and the information that the user deduces from that. So as content designers, we try to communicate something specific, but we don't have the power to control how our content is interpreted. So what does the label plain mean? I think that when we talk about plain English or plain language, we intend plain to mean these words on the left: straightforward, accessible, clear, open, direct. But plain can also mean these words on the right: boring, basic, dull, generic, not specialized, and most crucially, non-technical. So while we might be meaning these things on the left, we might also be communicating these things on the right. And I think that's a problem, because it means that we might be communicating to people that the thing we're advocating for is basic or non-technical. And for some people, that will mean that it's low value, which means that when we demonstrate how we've taken some complicated writing and just rewritten it in plain language, we could be really talking ourselves down. Categorizing skills or methods as technical and non-technical, hard and soft, is a persistent problem that undermines the value of some types of work. And it's definitely something that I learned early on in life when I started making choices about what I was interested in learning. When I decided I'd rather focus on arts and social sciences over maths and physics. And for me, that still persists. Content design and content designers have a problem with being perceived as non-technical. It's not something that I want us to reinforce. Leadership coach Mandy Brown says, the non-technical nomenclature not only does a disservice to that work and to those people, it also diminishes the ability of the organisation to really get the most benefit from those skills. It's difficult to earn value from the things that you disparage, even if the disparagement is superficially polite. I really like this quote because it captures what I often see. In a lot of organisations, there's a perception that technical skills are more valuable than non-technical skills. And that means that in those organisations, the perspectives of those doing non-technical work are less likely to be valued and less likely to influence decision makers. Later, I'll say a bit more about why those perceptions are made and the biases that underpin them. But right now I want to focus on how that perception doesn't just impact content designers, it also impacts our users, because a really crucial part of our role is advocating for users. So if the perspectives of content designers aren't being heard, the needs of users aren't being heard. By using the term plain to describe our methodology, a term that some stakeholders might see as synonymous with non-technical, we're kind of contributing to this technical, non-technical binary, and as a result, undermining the value of a core part of our content design expertise. In other words, when we centre our work in discussions about plain language, we could be signalling to decision makers that our work is not important. We end up in the bottom left-hand corner of this chart. And we don't just describe writing as itself as plain, we also refer to words as plain or technical, and talk about writing for technical or specialist audiences. And when we do this, we're making a judgment about our audience as well. We're making assumptions about what type of language people prefer and what that means about them as a person, how knowledgeable or intelligent they are. This is particularly problematic when we often talk about plain language as being more accessible. Of course, we have evidence to know that for most people, shorter words and sentences are much easier to read and understand, but that doesn't mean that people with a preference for plain language aren't technical. So if there's a strong connection between plain language and accessibility, then we might also be associating soft skills with disability, and by contrast, technical skills with being non-disabled. And for me, this system of language association has to change, not just because it undervalues the work of content design, but it potentially undervalues groups of people. So the point I want to make is this: making language plain is a terrible way to describe what we do, because it devalues us, our work, and our users. And while I've been thinking about this and this talk, I kind of been wondering if this is a minor distraction and if this really matters. The conclusion that I came to was, for me, that it does, because in our line of work, I think it's our job to think about these things. Information architect Lisa Marie Martin says that when we consider the impact, not just the intentions behind our categorical choices, we are more likely to build systems that work for real people. And I believe this. I think that the unintentional impact of our language is something we need to consider if we want to build systems that value content design, content designers, and our users. So does using the term plain contribute to people discounting our recommendations and our value? I think it's very likely that it does, yes. I also think that focusing on plain language stops us talking about what is really important, and that's user-centered language, which I'll go into now. So on to my second reason for why we should stop talking about plain language. As I've said, I think that as content professionals, we often rely on plain language as a shortcut to explain the work we do. I also think that our audience is likely to interpret this as us saying we kind of followed this magic set of writing rules. And when that happens, we're miscommunicating what content design is about. Why? Well, I think it's important to remember that designing good content is not necessarily about creating something that works for anyone and everyone. It's about understanding and meeting the needs of a specific group of people who we call our users, the people the content is intended for. I work on a government service, and it's very much my responsibility to ensure that the content I design is inclusive and accessible to as broad a range of people as possible. I need to ensure that I'm not creating barriers for anyone trying to access what should be a universally available service. But you might be working on content for medical professionals, and there's a lot of jargon in medicine. And although we need to recognise that this creates barriers for people outside the field, if we were to remove all the jargon, it would create barriers to medical professionals to be able to do their jobs quickly and effectively under pressure. This is some content from the Research Council Guidelines on Resuscitation. I'm going to attempt to read it. If cardioversion fails to restore sinus rhythm and the patient remains unstable, give amiodarone 300 milligrams intravenously over 10 to 20 minutes, or procainamide 10 to 15 milligrams over 20 minutes, and reattempt electrical cardioversion. The loading dose of amiodarone can be followed by an infusion of 900 milligrams over 24 hours. It's okay that not everyone understands this, because anyone following these guidelines will have the training and experience to follow this highly specialized language. And in fact, it's this specialized language that allows those professionals in a high pressure situation to communicate complicated information quickly and with precision, which is absolutely vital to a job that is highly time sensitive and is about saving people's lives. So how does this relate to content design? Well, as content designers, we know that we need to understand our audience before making content decisions. We design good content by researching our users' specific needs and translating this into content that's relevant in a format that works for our audience. But if you put content like this in front of most people, it's unlikely that they would really be able to understand it. I definitely don't. There are, of course, principles and heuristics around making writing easier to understand. These heuristics guide our work every day and form the basis of helpful tools like design systems and style guides, things like choosing shorter words, using bullet points. But of course, these heuristics and principles are just guides, and we can't design content in a one-size-fits-all way. One person's jargon is another person's domain language. So, in my experience, too often when we explain our work to stakeholders, we overlook that and focus on plain language. We introduce content design to teams by showing a before and after example of some content, focusing on how we chose simpler words, or we show a Flesch-Kincaid score. We neglect the deeper strategic work that we've done for something bite-sized and something that fits more easily onto a slide. And when we do this, and I've definitely done this, it's usually because we're overloaded with work and need to put something together quickly that we can share easily. But when we're focusing on representing our work as making things plain language, we're not really communicating the value of our work, because we're kind of giving the impression that content design is following a set of rules. And at this point, I do want to say that I think using simple language in most cases is important and worthwhile, but I'm concerned that if we keep leading with this, then others outside our profession are hearing it as that this is what content design is. This is all content design is. And I think there are 3 reasons why we often prioritize plain language in our content discussions. Firstly, the end product of our work, the content, is often a lot more visible than the research or strategy that went into it. And it's very visibly work that we have done. It's easy to show a before and after of a piece of content and explain it with very little context. And if we're working in a multidisciplinary team, showing a piece of content clearly shows what we've contributed. There might be blurred lines of ownership when we talk about areas like research, but if we just talk about the content, then that's our work, and we're not treading on anyone's toes. Secondly, if we talk about content decisions in terms of plain language, then we're often implying rules-based decision making. Sentences can only be 20 words long, use the active voice. And if our content decisions are rules-based, then we know with certainty when we're right and when we're wrong. And when we couch our content decisions in user research, there's room for interpretation, there's room to be challenged. But when content design is a set of rules that we know, our egos can stay in a very safe place, which leads to my final reason I think we tend to prioritize plain language in our discussions. There's a lot of interpretation and judgment in our work when we're taking user needs and translating that into content. And I think that's quite out of sync with a lot of organizations and how they perceive the value of work. There's often a focus on KPIs, quantitative data, measurable objectives above all else. So I think that we emphasize plain language and readability because they're quantifiable and solid, and they make sense quickly. In other words, we simplify the complexity of what we do into metrics. But I don't think that works The philosopher Karl Popper talks about how there are two types of problems, clocks and clouds. A clock can be taken apart, analysed, and you can understand how it works. It's a sort of scientific problem that we tend to like in our workplaces and society as a whole. Clouds, on the other hand, are changing, complex, and often unpredictable, like human behaviour. If you reduce a cloud to its parts, you still can't fully understand how a cloud actually works. It's not a sum of its parts. And I think that that's the kind of problem space we often work in as content designers. We have to look at complex organisational structures and the subtle relationships between people. We have to understand power and privilege and how that might come out in our work. And we have to understand users' mindsets and behaviours and how they might be feeling at a time when they read a piece of content. When we focus on plain language, I think we're often trying to make the problems we work on into clock problems. And I don't think that really works, because I think content designers are in the cloud business. So the final point I want to discuss today is this. When we focus our content design discussions around plain language, we're not only miscommunicating what content design is, we're selling ourselves short. Why do I think this? Well, designing simple products and services is really, really hard work, which is why there are lots of companies and professions that own that. No one would describe the work that Apple or Dyson do, the products they build, as plain. In fact, for those companies, building products that work intuitively with no unnecessary clutter is the very basis of their brand, and the reason that they're able to charge a lot more than their competitors. And I think there's a lot going on here with perceptions of value, particularly around Apple and Dyson. It's not a coincidence that both of these companies have a visionary founder who's a straight white man, often characterized as a lone creative genius. And I also don't think that's what any of us should be aspiring to or can aspire to. In fact, I think it's helpful to dig a bit deeper into the relationship between simplicity and power. So if you're in a position of high power and you create something simple, it's because, sorry, I'm losing my voice. It's because you're a genius and a visionary with this kind of strong innate sense of taste. You use clarity and wisdom to cut through this noise that everyone else is blinkered by. But if you're in a position of low power and you create something simple, you've made it plain, you've used common sense and basic rules to make your decisions. Anyone could have done what you did. So the point is this. When we prioritise plain language advocacy, we're doing so out of a desire to work openly and collaboratively and share our process. But by focusing on the tools and techniques we use over the value we can add, we sometimes undermine the authority that we need to be heard and to successfully deliver that user-centered content. So you might ask, what is the real value of content design that I think we should be focusing on? Well, when I think of the times in my career when I felt like I've made the most breakthroughs and had the biggest impact for users, it's actually rarely to do with writing content. The content has been a byproduct of the much messier, much less quantifiable work. It's when I've spent time building relationships with people who work most closely with users, giving them a voice in the design process. It's when I've been able to bring together different departments that previously didn't talk to each other and rallied them around the common purpose of making things easier for customers. And it's when I've prioritised helping colleagues in legal and policy to understand why user-centred design matters, and then hearing that they've been advocating for users when I'm not in the room. Because I think what we're really good at as a profession is breaking down complexity and communicating ideas to people in a way that they understand. We're really good at developing clear strategies and understanding what needs to happen across an organisation to bring that together. We're really good at working across silos because we have to speak to people in a lot of different departments. And we're also really good at making data-informed decisions that reduce risks for organisations, even if those decisions can't always be explained quickly or neatly. And the great user-centred content we produce happens because of all of this background work. And I think that this is work that we're rarely acknowledged for, never mind taking credit for. You simply cannot put plain language on something that's confusing and unconnected and somehow make it useful and useful. That's why content designers are often working away behind the scenes to try and fix the product or service at the same time as writing the content for it. And yeah, why do we tend not to talk about this stuff? Well, I think that historically there's a lot of mystique around writing and the writing process. Like lots of creative work, I think it's sometimes perceived as this effortless process where we're mere conduits of words that flow through us, and it can at times feel very instinctual, particularly if you see yourself as a natural problem solver or you've been doing the job for a long time. Recently, I was talking to a very talented, experienced content designer, and she said content design is just something I do. But this isn't true. Being a good content designer takes skill, compassion, knowledge, and deep understanding. It's a craft that's developed through long hours and hard work. I really want to hear people working in content own that expertise. So if that's something you've said or thought in the past, then I kind of want to say, stop talking yourself down. What you do is not obvious or easy. Yes, anyone can understand the basic principles of content design when they're explained clearly, but that is also true of most other expertise. If you sit someone down and tell them the basic principles of swimming, it's very likely that they would understand it, but that doesn't mean that then they could jump in a pool and start swimming. So how can we better communicate the layers of value that we bring? Well, I definitely don't have all the answers, but I think a great simple tool to describe our impact better is Jesse James Garrett models for the 5 planes of user experience design. So when we focus on plain language, we're talking about this kind of very surface level layer of what we do. And I think this is the most superficial and least valuable part of our work. And it also doesn't work unless it's built on good foundations. So when we're talking about that surface level work, let's connect that back to the strategy, our user needs. Let's link that back to the scope and what we need to provide, or our requirements. The structure, what's the basis of decisions around priority, and what does the information architecture look like? And what's the skeleton? How does the user navigate between different places? And what message do we want to communicate to them? I think we often rely on visual designers to kind of cover this stuff, but it all really impacts on content, and it's our strategy and design work to discuss as well. And I think it's important because no one will really understand the value of the surface level work, the language, without understanding how and why those decisions were made. Plain language is not going to convince anyone to value content design any more than conversations about grids can help someone understand the value of visual design. And we need to tell people why they should care. And I think that starts when we stop focusing on plain language. So just sum up. You might be wondering, what do I want to happen? Well, as a profession, I want us to stop talking about plain language and plain English. As I've talked about today, I don't think it's really serving us. And I want us to focus more on the why rather than the how of what we do, and find ways to talk about the deep rooted value we add. And this means having better discussions about our craft with people outside content design. And I want us to stop playing down our value. I want us to be more confident in our abilities, our skill and experience, and stop saying things like, I just rewrote it in plain English. I know that our jobs are often hectic and we can't do everything, and we need to look after ourselves firstly. And of course, there are times when writing techniques should be discussed as part of a broader conversation. And I think as well, it should never fall on the shoulders of individual content designers to continuously advocate for our practice. And I know it often does, but that's up to directors who decided to add content designers to their team and now need to invest in building a practice to support them. It's up to our managers and leaders to understand, to ensure that the teams we're working with understand what we're here to do. And yeah, you're probably wondering if I have any suggestions on what terms to use instead to talk about plain language techniques. And I think the problem is old and is deep-rooted and complicated. And I definitely don't think that issues with how content is valued can be completely addressed by a name change. But maybe we don't need to dig too deep for an alternative either. We talk a lot about user-centered design, but we don't talk so much about user-centered language or user-centered content. I also think clear language is a much better term. What I do know is this: for too long, we've given plain language too much power, but we have power over how we work and what it means to design content. I believe that we're shaping the future of our profession together. And for me, part of that is putting plain language back in its place. Let's make sure that it's a tool that we can use without giving it power over us. And let's keep steering the conversation back to what we know really matters, and that's our users. Thank you.